Hey Dom, thank you for coming in. You're like a prodigy. You've been involved since you were a kid or when you were very young in tech, programming tech, programming. In fact, you were won one of the top gaming conferences. That's something when you're doing it in college, which I would. I mean, you're leading this amazing thing, almost like Skunkworks, Next Generation at Lockheed, with your own team of engineers, handling, multi-billion-dollar kind of interventions. You'd be in there as a almost like a SWAT team coming in and solving problems when something got stuck. And you'd be involved with the ACM, Association of Computing Machinery, which is the number one computing organization in the world. We're actually the largest for many, many, many years. And then, of course, you've been working in defense projects, working with defense contractors. You have your own company. I mean, what haven't you done, right? So it's pretty remarkable. So thank you for coming in, and a friend as well, a good friend. So thank you for coming in, sharing your views with our audience.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Stephen. You've been such a great mentor to me over the years and helped me connect to some of the right people, the movers and the shakers in the industry, and taught me a lot about technology and companies and business. So I really appreciate all that you've done for me over the years and being your friend for over a decade now, I think. And it's definitely been a journey, but thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to chat with me today as well.
Well, Dom, we did an interview before, and where you talked about sort of your journey, and then is this with Lockheed Martin, where you were driving this next generation of Skunk Works and delivering over 1 billion in revenue annually, and we talked about some of the work you did in college. So I'll link to that in the interview, so they have that kind of prior history. But you left Lockheed and then you went and worked with various defense contractors where you headed up their applications program. So why don't we get caught up to date on some of that work? And then let's get into Harpoon, this company you started and what you're doing there. So can you talk about post Lockheed and some of that journey?
Sure, sure. Lockheed was excellent training, taught me a lot about working for a Fortune 500 company, working for a large business, and having to operate with all these different arms and legs and everything involved in running a large corporation. But I was abhorrently unpopular there amongst the leadership, and practically chased out of the company because I was just trying to do disruptive things, and that has problems when and I mean, now being an executive, I sort of understand their viewpoint a little bit better, but at the time I was just like, I'm gonna light this room on fire and see what happens, and if you're trying to run a large organization, you can't have people lighting rooms on fire. You want to go make sure everyone's you know keeping their fire starting equipment in the right safe places. But I was just trying to disrupt industry and build disruptive capabilities and take risks. And to me, there's always sort of a roadmap, as if I do these things, then this will be the result most likely. And it didn't seem as risky in my mind. When I think about the executives at Lockheed that were viewing what I was doing at the time, it was probably the equivalent of somebody like building an earthquake device and just turning it on to see what would happen. So um, it just became apparent to me eventually that maybe a large corporation wasn't the place where I should spend the rest of my career because I was just drawn to risk, I guess. And ended up going and working for a small business. They were more focused with the Navy. And I knew how to build and scale an organization in a Fortune 500 company, but I didn't know how to scale a small business that didn't have a bunch of name recognition and a bunch of lawyers, teams of lawyers you could call, or anybody that you needed to call to ask a question in the middle of the night, you could feasibly reach out to them. In a small business, it's usually a small contingent of people who are kind of running the company, and you can't typically rely on your brand and your name recognition to scale and get meetings with customers and things like that. So it was a real challenge for sure, and it was a challenging environment for me to sort of cut my teeth on business and learn how to scale an organization. So as part of that group, I was the head of engineering, and but I was also pretty much number three in the company. So my job was not only engineering, but scaling and dealing with business stuff and winning contracts and negotiating with government and everything in between, as most people wear a lot of hats in small businesses. So I not only got to design a lot of key systems for the Navy in my engineering hat role, but I also had to win business and win contracts and negotiate contracts and all those things. So we ended up scaling the business from somewhere around 5 or 6 million a year when I started to 5 years later being around $70 million. There was some turnaround involved in that business. And when I hit the 5 year mark, I just realized I'd kind of hit the top of the company. So I left and worked for another company called Omni Federal that was more Air Force focused. And they were around $4 or $5 million at the time. And I helped them scale to 60 million in 2 years. And along the way, like I was just looking for more challenges, like we talked about with risk. So I started my own consultancy and started doing fractional CTO consulting. From some of the skills I learned in those businesses, I learned how to sort of parachute into different companies and figure out what the problems were and do damage control and, get projects and companies sort of on the right path. And those skills really lended well to consulting from a business and technology perspective. And that business kind of took off right away. And then working with the Navy, actually, I just became apparent to me from a DevOps perspective. I got into the DevOps game really early, thanks to Lockheed, actually. And they had this project where well, in the internal research and development organization of Lockheed, there was this shift in like 2012, 2013, maybe, where everyone's going from service-oriented architecture to what's now called the cloud. At the time, there wasn't much cloud to speak of. There was, a few managed services from AWS, and in the IRAD community, at Lockheed, they spent a gajillion dollars this particular year manually deploying virtual machines, EC2 instances in AWS, because everybody was switching to the cloud. And so during a gating review, the executives had to watch people manually deploy EC2 instances about 9,000 times. And they freaked out and they put me in charge of the reference architecture implementation for cloud automation for Lockheed, which eventually people started calling DevOps. At the time, I thought it was a punishment because I was, more in software. And I was probably deserving of some punishment, given my antics. I just started working with containers and cloud automation tools very early on before there wasn't a lot of tools available. And what became apparent to me that it was common sense and that everybody would be doing it in a few years. And that's how I've helped scale some of those companies I worked with, bringing some of that DevOps expertise and building those capabilities. Anyway, I'm going to stop there, Stephen. There's been a bunch of stuff going on, but I think that's a good background.
It's fascinating, right? I mean, you indicated Lockheed, you led a team that were looking for areas that needed help. Maybe they got stuck, but that would be considered maybe disruptive within in fact, I think they're the world's largest defense contractor as well. So and there will be more of a conservative approach, and then you come in and you're looking to fix problems or seeing potential problems and then trying to fix them and so on, and that would create disruption sometimes, right? Make people feel uncomfortable because you'd be saying, I see could be an issue and we should go in and fix it. But yet that's valuable later, right? Because you're doing it, but then what you did is you learned, you gain maturity in the way you dealt with people. That's what I'm hearing, right?
That's
So,
generous. That's generous to say that I gained maturity. Thank you, Stephen.
so in that maturity, though, you would in your team sometimes maybe have somebody who was like a Dom of years ago, and how would you manage that now? Because there's the Dom, and then you have somebody that's a Dom that's not quite reached maturity in there, and they work with others on projects. And when you're working with defense projects, you need some stability in there, right, as well. So how would you manage that? And then we'll get into your company.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a big supporter of people who are really engaged. I think the tricky part about engaged employees is that they can quickly turn into disengaged employees or jaded employees or disruptive employees if you don't know how to leverage uh, an engaged employee. And I think that there's a misconception in corporate management about, like, these are the things that I need to do, and this person is like going off over here to the left. And so I just need to steer them over here to the right and get them in line with what everybody else is doing. And that is a completely logical thought, right? But at the end of the day, if somebody's so engaged that they're charting their own course, it is probably not going to be motivating for them to just be put back in a box and say, like, just get in line with everybody else, right? And so that's probably going to exacerbate the problem that you had in the first place, because now they're going to be bored, in addition to being engaged and disruptive. And so when I have employees like that, I just try to see where they're going. Like, I try to understand, like, where are you taking the ship? When are you going to be back? It's kind of like if you have kids and you try to be really strict on them, and you make them go to church every Sunday, and you make them say they have to be in bed by 6 o'clock, and they're not allowed to see their friends and all this stuff. Like, that's all well and good, but eventually those children are going to rebel, like, they're going to create problems, because you have to give everybody a little bit of rope. And really engaged employees need lots and lots of rope. And so what I've figured out is just, you can talk to them and figure out, like, hey, why are you doing these things? Where are you planning on going with these? And then try to chart the course with them. You can sit down and say, like, hey, listen, I'm doing this thing over here, and you're doing this other thing over here, and I definitely need my thing to succeed. Where can we tie those two things together? Like, how can you help me over here on the right side while you're doing your thing on the left side? How can you contribute to the right side as you're doing your own thing? And, like, where can we meet in the middle? Like, what is going to be the ultimate goal of these things? And sometimes, like, I certainly wasn't perfect when I was a younger engineer. I had lots of things to grow and understand. But I would also say, like, if someone was willing to take the time to talk to me and show interest in what I was doing, it probably would have been open to changing course. Like, it wasn't that I had this one set idea and I was definitely going to go there. And regardless of any conversation I had, I was experimenting, and I wanted to figure out how to connect it to something larger. And so sometimes when you talk to somebody, they'll say, oh, you're right, I'm not sure this is relevant to what we're doing. Maybe I'll go work on some other project. And that's fine. And other times you'll find this amazing collaboration opportunity where you can find that this is going to really dramatically impact something or be disruptive to the project or capability you're trying to build at some point, and say, like, let's work on it together. and we'll meet in the middle at some point in the future, but I also need you to help over here. So like, let's figure that out.
Right. So what I'm hearing then is you're respecting that other person's point of view. You're listening to that other person's point of view. And in fact, you reiterate their point of view to show that you understand. And then you show the path of where they can converge at some point, and yet respecting their approach to things, and ultimately having it converge so it'll accelerate your project in some way. And as you mentioned, it could enhance it. And maybe the word disrupt is a bad word now, but it'll enhance it in some way. It'll accelerate it in some way because it's such an exponential idea that could be quite a game changer to what you're doing as well. So I can see how that's a great management process, right? You're working as peers, collaborating, working together to achieve common goals, and those could be personal goals, professional goals, but ultimately to the big mission goal for the enterprise that you're delivering projects to. At some point, you decided to start this company. So can you talk more about Harpoon and why you decided to start this company? And you've laid some of the seeds, right? You said you're working at Lockheed. You could see them going into the cloud. You could see all of this automation or having to repeat things. But if you can automate that, it would make things so much easier. And you were put in charge of trying to kind of make this more automated. And that became the foundation for Harpoon, right?
Yeah, so very early beginnings, I would say. So, like I mentioned, I kind of got turned on to DevOps when I was at Lockheed because of a terrible thing that happened in the IRAD community there. And so when I went to my next company, Salute, um, they weren't even doing any DevOps at the time. No one was calling it DevOps. There was no DevOps. So I wasn't sure what to call it, honestly. And so I told leadership there, like, we're gonna invest some time in whatever this is called, because in a few years, everyone will be doing it. And to their credit, they said that sounds like a good idea. So we did, and we got some very early work with the Navy, and we were able to again, this was at the time maybe more like 2014, 2015. So Docker started making containers popular in 2011. They weren't popular yet in 2011. They came into existence then, and Kubernetes became a thing from Google Borg in 2013. So these are fairly early timelines on the DevOps spectrum. And so, like a year after Kubernetes, we were working with the Navy to completely automatically deploy Kubernetes on Navy ships floating out in the ocean. And it was a cool project because, we were automatically bootstrapping Kubernetes clusters into the AWS cloud environment for like their shore deployments. And we were automatically deploying things over, questionable network links into the middle of the ocean on top of the stack that the Navy was running. So the Navy was actually really innovative in this space, and a lot of people don't know about it. Like years later, the Air Force created this concept of a software factory, and they called the first one that they made Kessel Run. There's like an affinity for Star Wars in the Air Force, so and that was kind of like a spark that became a roaring fire, because from there was I don't know how many software factories, but there's been a lot of them since then, and they all have some sort of Star Trek, Star Wars reference. Kessel Run, Bespin, Kobayashi Maru, like there's interesting mix of different software factories. But what's interesting is the Navy was like the first one to do it. They never really moved into that whole software factory phase from this initial success story. But that kind of goes along with the story. So, what I was finding at the time was there was this belief at the time that all software engineers were eventually going to be well versed in DevOps. I don't know why everyone believed that, but it was definitely the mantra of the time. And so there was just this general feeling like if I want some DevOps engineers, I'll just go hire some software engineers and they'll magically know DevOps, right? And that worked about as well as it sounds when I say it now. So it was almost impossible to find any DevOps engineers. Nobody had any experience with any of the tools. When I found people, even with 1 year of experience in any of the tools, and they worked for me for 6 months, somebody else was willing to pick them off for 20% more. Because now everyone else was looking for DevOps people to like automate deployments. And so I just kind of watched this cycle really early on, and I realized it was going to be untenable, this whole DevOps thing, because there was never going to be a point where all software engineers were DevOps experts, just like there's never going to be a point where all software engineers are experts in, artificial intelligence or machine learning, or they're not all data scientists, right? And that it was going to continue to be impossible to find this talent, especially the top of the pile, and to keep them and to pay them enough. And when I moved from project to project and from company to company, that even when we were using exactly the same tools like Terraform and Ansible and Kubernetes and Docker, each implementation within that company was a unique snowflake. And I still needed Frank and Bob, to explain to me how they had put their software deployment together. And there was a lot of learning curve, even for companies using the same tech stack, because all of the scripts were entirely different. And so just early on, I said, look, this is a very untenable situation. And these are the scripts that are running the software for entire companies and the Department of Defense and, other things. And so somebody's going to commoditize DevOps to a degree. I don't know what that looks like, but I should start thinking about it. And that's how Harpoon was born.
That's fascinating. So how long did it take for you to do this full deployment of Harpoon? What does Harpoon look like? Can you sort of give a chat GPT description of or a Bing AI description of what Harpoon is?
Well, I don't know if I'm as talented as ChatGPT in explaining things, but Harpoon, the best way to think about Harpoon is that it's a no-code Kubernetes platform. So if you've ever tried to use Kubernetes before, it's a very terminal or command line based experience for the most part. So you have this thing that is called kubectl or kube control, some people like to call it. And it's just a prompt like ChatGPT actually. And so like you just type stuff in, except you have to know all the lingo, and there's a bunch of keywords like speaking a particular language. A lot of the descriptors for telling Kubernetes what to do is in a language called YAML, which actually stands for yet another markup language. And it's very, a lot of it is just very manual. Like you have to understand a ton of different keywords. You have to understand a ton of different commands. When you're writing the YAML, you have to understand, like indentations have to be perfect, and the width, like you have, in the way that YAML works, you have like a top layer and then your indented layer, and then you can have multiple other indented layers, and you can put in the wrong word in any of those sequences, and like everything blows up and dies. And like there's a high degree of potential error in Kubernetes. Certainly people have like written scripts and automated some things and tried to make it easier. Even getting Kubernetes running has been a pain in the butt for almost a decade now, and people have really innovated on that. They've just tried to make it easier to get Kubernetes running in the first place. Now it wasn't the case when I started, but now you can go to one of your cloud service providers, whichever one you want, and you can deploy their particular flavor of Kubernetes fairly easily. Like you follow some commands and you click some buttons and do some things, and like most people can probably get to that point. Unfortunately, even when you use the cloud service provider versions of Kubernetes, like EKS for AWS and AKS for Azure and GKE for Google Cloud, you still have to know how to use Kubernetes. So it's this whole problem with day two ops is what they call it. After I have the cluster running, how do I use it? And unfortunately, the state of the art in that today is I have to be a master at using Kubernetes and writing YAML and, understand all the keywords in the language and how to do everything manually. And so to me, that seems silly. Like it should be easy to have your software deployed in the cloud or on premise or anywhere you want to put your Kubernetes cluster. And so I endeavored to build a tool that was so easy that, the pizza guy could use it. You could order a pizza, you can come over to your house and you could tell them to drag these things and, click these buttons. And eventually you'd have your software deployed in Kubernetes in some environment. And I think to a degree we've done it. So I started building this tool in my nights and weekends in 2017 and got a working MVP with Docker Swarm fairly early on. But it was obvious to me that Kubernetes was winning the whole container orchestration war. And we kind of pivoted to Kubernetes somewhere along the way. And it is a massive effort to go from working prototype or MVP to enterprise software product. There's just so many nuanced little details in there that you never think of. And it took us quite a while to get to an enterprise software product. But here we are 5 or 6 years later, and we have quite a few people using the tool, and we're seeing quite a growth curve, and we found a vacuum in the market still, even all this time later, and getting a lot of interesting use cases for the tool.
So is there some kind of hub that people can contact you on somewhere? So they can, or some community where they can share lessons and best practices using your tool, or are you speaking at these conferences now, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, you can certainly talk to us on our website. We're at harpoon.io. It's been really awesome working with some of the big players in the space. So we partnered with Docker and built a Docker extension. So we're in the Docker extensions marketplace and Docker desktop, which is crazy because they have, millions of active users for Docker desktop. So Harpoon is now available on your local desktop environment. And we recently worked with GitHub to be added to GitHub's marketplace as an app. And we're not stopping there. So it's been really awesome working with these different partners, and they've sort of shown a light on what it is we're offering, because I think it is a disruptive capability in the marketplace, given what the current state of the art is. And when we show it to people, like it is usually a response of disbelief. People will usually say like, wow, that's pretty amazing, and then they'll say like, but how do I know it's working? So we actually had to build a feature entirely for the purposes of proving that it actually works, where we could Harpoon, when you're dragging a box, an element onto the workspace, it's dynamically generating a bunch of YAML or other scripting or code in the background based on whatever it is that you're dragging. So that's one of the major differences between Harpoon and, competitors. Competitors are usually taking a curated list of software that a lot of people use, and they're putting it in a box, and you can search for it and you can drag it out, but they've written that stuff manually like most other people. Harpoon, as a system, dynamically generates the deployment scripting for any piece of software on the planet. So there's not a curated list, it's dynamically doing that. And that's what really makes us disruptive. And so people didn't believe us. So we had to build this feature that shows when you click a button, the dynamic scripts and YAML that we generate, and you can change them, and you can click save and it will redeploy dynamically any of the changes as well. So after we built that, people stopped asking us if it works, but it wasn't part of our initial roadmap.
So what's the activity like? Are you getting like one download a day or something? Or
Yeah, it's been crazy because I would say at the end of last year, I think the hardest problem for a startup, for a new business is one of credibility. Like big enterprise companies and even bootstrap startups, they don't know who I am, and they don't know like what my skill set is, or if I'm able to build a good team or a good software product. It's all just kind of faith-based, until somebody either runs into a problem and writes us in a horrible hate mail, or somebody just starts using it and they're like, yeah, actually this kind of works pretty good. So from that standpoint, it's really hard as a startup or a new company without, like raising some huge VC round or something where somebody's like, yeah, it's probably fine. I'll probably use it because there's a lot of other people that use it, to sort of get that credibility and get in there and have people believe that you've built this disruptive product. When we partnered with Docker, I think that was a turning point, because Docker doesn't just let anybody put an extension in their marketplace. They sit there, they're like super involved. The team was super awesome, the extensions team, when we were working with them. And they sit there and they test your app. Like they don't let you put it in the marketplace all willy-nilly. They say like, I'm going to try to use it, and if it breaks, I'm going to say no, right? So there's a whole team at Docker that sat there and banged on Harpoon and tried to use it, and I think they were as surprised as everybody else. I don't think they expected it to work, so they were like hitting it. They're like, "This is actually pretty cool. I actually think we really need to put this in our marketplace. It does work." So that was really cool to get that validation from such a well-known brand in the industry. But once we hit the marketplace, I mean, we did very little. We did like a joint blog that we wrote together, which they do with, all of their extensions right now. And definitely there was some activity in the marketplace because they have so many active users. But I mean, in 5 months, we went from probably 20 users to 18,000. And, you know, recently we've been seeing a trend of getting 1,000 new users a week. So the growth curve's been pretty dramatic. And obviously there's been some lessons learned with user experience and things like those along the way, things we didn't count on, like somebody getting lost in the app and rage clicking 50 times and then, doing something we didn't expect. But we've been able to work with the community of people using Harpoon, and they've been super awesome at answering questions and hopping on calls and, telling us what's working and what's not working. And we really dialed that in and tweaked those things over the last couple of months, and even built in an interactive tutorial into the tool, so that the first time or later on, if you decide you want, the guided way of using Harpoon, it will take you in step by step exactly how to deploy things in Kubernetes with our visual interface, and how to change things and configure things and set environment variables and do all the things that you possibly can in the tool. And we've seen a massive success rate with the tutorial. 80% of people that sign up decide to go through it, and we see a really high success rate in people finishing the tutorial and getting their cluster up and running.
Well, that's great. So you must have videos and stuff on YouTube too, or something like that, right?
Yeah, we do have like a docs page. So like docs.harpoon.io is just where you can go, and there's little videos to show you how to do everything. But the interactive tutorial is directly in the tool as sort of like an extension to the tool. And most people get by just with that. So it just tells you exactly what to do and why you're doing it. And we don't actually get a ton of support tickets from people who finish the tutorial because they seem to be just using it successfully.
So it used to be, right? You had to be a DevOps person, even when you had an automated tool. Ultimately, you had to be a DevOps person and really understand it. In fact, you could do it without the automation. Do you think now you can do DevOps with your tool without being a DevOps person, or do you still need a fair amount of grounding, almost being like an expert?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think we're seeing so there's a few different types of people that use our tool. Some of them are people who have gone through the pain of standing up a Kubernetes cluster and maintaining them. And the response from those people is fun because they say typically like, this is a huge pain and like it's really easy to use your tool. And why would I go through that pain if I could just use your tool, right? And then there's other people who are just more, they've never really gone through the DevOps ecosystem, but they're software developers and they really understand software. And we find those people are very successful using the tool. And they say things like, I'm really glad this tool is out there because I didn't want to learn all of this stuff. And I mean, I think that mentality sounds lazy, but I think it's really comes from a place of efficiency. Like software engineers, there's a lot that's asked of them. Like I need all these features built, I need them pushed, tomorrow. And a way to get there faster that they know is going to work and is going to be fairly easy and not involved is like a big efficiency gain for most software engineers. But what's been most interesting is the no code type user that we've run into. And I don't think we ever really expected to be so popular with the no code, low code community, but there's an entire new, especially with generative AI and ChatGPT, like there's this whole huge new market of people who are building applications who have no software background, definitely no DevOps background, and they're building capabilities that probably would have been impossible even 3 to 5 years ago. So they're using tools like Noodle and Bubble, and a lot of other tools that have kind of come to market. I mean, the best and worst parts of those tools is they're very prescriptive in the way that you can use them mostly, because by being prescriptive, they can keep you in a more contained box and they can have you have more success by saying like, these are the things that you can do. But, like a larger number of people can get through that and be successful. But, now people want to use OpenAI, right? They want to use the APIs from OpenAI to go use generative AI to solve their problems. And there's no, at least not yet, there's no like box in these tools that like you just hook into the OpenAI API or other things like that. So they're going out and they're like finding tutorials, or they're going into ChatGPT and asking them to like build them Docker files, to do things or write code. And then they're like throwing that into a container image or figuring out like these tutorials on the internet, which I think is awesome, by the way, like that people without software backgrounds are being successful in building actual software applications and kind of just going out and finding the information they need on the internet and making it work. I think there's going to be a huge number of new businesses that are operating in this way where actual founders, even non-technical founders, are building tools and applications and services and capabilities that just don't exist today, and without even going and hiring a software development team, just kind of making it work. And so they need a place to host the software that they're running, and they're reading about Kubernetes and all these things, and then they're like going through the Kubernetes tutorial, and they're like, okay, that's pretty involved. And they're actively going out and finding in their searches Harpoon and saying like, this is what I've been looking for. I needed a way to deploy this stuff easily. And there's a large amount of our user base that are these particular users that are just kind of trying to make it work. So it's been really interesting figuring out the different types of users to use the platform, and finding out that in fact there are lots of users that are using it that have no software background or no DevOps background.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating. Or people who've been coding for like 60 years, right? Like I have, and used to code in machine language and then assembler and C and things like that, and then higher level languages. And I'm curious now. I probably should take a few weeks off, sort of, so continue what I'm doing, and just start poking around with all of these automation or visual tools that are out there. Uh, so let's say for us, kind of seasoned guys who used to code in machine code and then move to assembler and then C and so on. Um, what languages would you suggest we look at other than like Copilot from IBM or from Microsoft? You have these GitHub tools, but you have Copilot and these code generator kind of capabilities. For us who have some fundamental skills, but now want to re-enter to kind of bring our skills up, what languages would you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer that software developers should choose the right tool for the job, so there's no one perfect language that really solves all problems. I think, typically a lot of what I find is that when people are trying to solve data science problems these days, so machine learning models and analytics and things like that, Python really has a ton of support for those type of things, and it's a pretty fun language to write. Um, that's usually what I recommend in those cases. I mean, if you're trying to build a web application these days, a lot of people are using React or Angular. A lot of they're leaning towards the mean stack or the MERN stack. And so it's interesting because, in some ways these web frameworks like React and Angular really do make things easier. And in other ways, they make things super complicated. Like I remember I was writing a website when I was 12 in HTML, and like if I want to put a link, an anchor tag, right, in a website, it's like one line of code, and I just like href equals blah blah blah, right? It's like 30 lines of code in Angular. Like I don't you need to like import a bunch of stuff as a dependency and do all this stuff. So yeah, it's really interesting. But overall, like there's a lot of benefits to using those frameworks, like especially cross-browser compatibility and things like that. And I mean, even things like Ruby is a really interesting language. I think it gets a bad rap because Rails didn't used to be super scalable from a web framework standpoint, but it's more human readable, and I think it's really good for beginners and people to pick up. I forced my wife to go through a coding tutorial with Ruby one time, and she's super smart anyway, but she's just breezing through everything. And so I think you'll see at some point, like, while the average software developer may never be a DevOps expert, like the average person will probably have some proficiency in code. Um, and certainly some of it will be using these no-code platforms or tools. Some of it will be using visual tools to do things, perhaps like Harpoon. But ultimately, I think as the tools become more accessible, generative AI becomes more accessible, more people will build tools, and it will force more people to like go out and explore learning different languages more. And whether you're an expert that's been doing it for a long time, that's going back to it, or you're somebody who's, in high school trying to make something work, so you don't trying to build a lawnmower that, automatically mows lawns or whatever using AI, ultimately the population is going to be pushed towards being a software developer. And I think that's really awesome. I think it will propel us into the future.
Do you use things like Visual Studio? Have you played with that recently, or it's been a while?
I use the God, what's it called? The I use WebStorm for a lot of my web application development. I don't, everybody else on my team uses Visual Studio though. So, I mean, it's one of the more popular IDs out there. It's all very preference based, I think. But it is cool to see some of these capabilities getting tied directly into IDEs like you're talking about. So, the Codex model and how GitHub has this capability to like do code completion and use generative AI to write code, I think is super awesome. Um, I would suggest that at the moment, the state of the art is you still need a software degree in a lot of cases to write with it. It's about asking the right questions and being able to validate whatever it's producing actually compiles and works and is what you wanted. I think validation is the key, right? So I can ask generative AI to write me some code, and it will definitely write me some code. In most cases, it will probably compile and do something. Question is like, does it do the thing that I want it to do? And that is the key, right? Is that validation. So as models get more reformed and mature, and we can more closely validate the intent of what the person who prompted the generative AI for with the completion of the loop, creating something that we validate is the right thing, then the tools will become more streamlined and more used. And I think what's interesting is a lot of people don't realize like that's a problem today, even doing it the manual way, right? Like people will come talk to software developers and they'll say like these are the things that I want, and then the software developers will build them and was like, here you go, here's what you asked for, and then a lot of people say this is what I wanted, right? So that's even hard for humans to do, and to like have the conversation and say like this is definitely what you wanted with all the features you wanted and all the things, because quite frequently in the software community, and this has existed since there were software engineers don't fully, and it's not because we're not sociable and we don't understand people, like that's a false perception, right? It's just because it's hard for you to convey an idea from your mind into my mind and me to build it and us to end up and agree that this is what we both wanted.
So just a couple more questions. I mean, what's your experience then using these large foundation models for code generation? Have you done a fair amount or started playing with it just to see what it's what the output is like? Is it fairly decent or not? Or
Yeah. I've experimented a little. Some of the software developers at Harpoon, they like to like go ask ChatGPT questions when they don't know the answer instead of searching Google. So certainly there's a lot of utility there as far as like a better search engine. Perhaps you have to be a little careful because sometimes you don't get the right answer. But if you have some basis in a field, then you can usually get a lot of utility out of that. I find that the generative AI models have some of the same problems with writing code that they do with writing blogs. Like if I go to ChatGPT and I say, like, write me 1,000-word blog post on puppies chasing balls, like it'll probably like a 1,000-word blog post about puppies chasing balls, but it will be a terrible blog and it won't be very engaging. It'll be very high level and sort of meh, and so from the same process, if I go to ChatGPT and tell it, use the Codex model to create me a medtech web application, maybe it will spit one out. I don't know, but it's probably not going to have any real use or utility. And so, meanwhile, if I go back to the tool and prompt it to say like, here's a bunch of questions. And I mean, most people who are using the tool significantly are doing these things anyway, but I start prompting it to give me the right questions. And then I, get granular in what I'm asking for. And I ask for details about the thing. And then the difficulty with that is like there is some requirement on the user to understand the right questions to ask and how to validate what the output is. And so the same thing is true for the codex model, right? Like if I can ask for a specific function with a specific output, and I can be very granular in my description of what I want, inputs and outputs, and what it's supposed to be doing, then I can probably get a pretty good base for an individual function. But I'm still going to have to know after that, like, how do I validate it? How do I make it sure it's the thing that I want? And I'm going to have to do that for every function inside of the class or the object that I'm trying to build. And then I'm going to do that, 100 more times for all the other classes that I need my enterprise application. So I see it as a way to gain efficiency, especially as things move into the future. But you still need sort of some of the right background today to be effective.
Yeah, and it's getting better, right? From GPT-3 to 3.5 Turbo to GPT-4, and then all of these plugins. I mean, I did try, you have Auto GPT. I was playing with Auto GPT, and I was thinking, well, that's kind of cool. What it's doing. But there's this, Smart GPT, and there's LangChain and Hugging Face, and there's Code Interpreter. I thought Code Interpreter is a really interesting plugin for ChatGPT. I use Bing a lot, Bing AI, and play with that quite a bit. In fact, probably use it every day now. Used to be maybe once a little while, but now every day I use it. I use it on my phone, things like that. So I'm becoming more reliant, it's augments, but like you say, you have to validate, you have to make sure, but it seems to be getting better, right? The system messaging, it seems to be better built in. And then there's these, I caught Andre Kaparthi's keynote, and I thought he had some really great points about, he talked about chain of thought and tree of thought. He talked about reflection and self-consistency, and then the use of plugins and things like that to increase your kind of the accuracy of these systems. So I think it's all fascinating. So okay, one final question. What's your recommendation to the audience?
Recommendation to the audience. I think being on topic here is to experiment with technology. There's so much out there now. Don't think that software is, specific to one class of people or people with computer science degrees. Like, go out and experiment with stuff, use the no coding platforms, mess around with ChatGPT or Bing's tool from Microsoft, and like try to write some code and see what happens. Like, what's the worst that could possibly happen? And use Harpoon to deploy it when you do. But at the end of the day, like I'm really excited to see everybody's ideas actually become reality. That's one of the great blessings that you can have as a software developer. Like, I can sit down at my laptop in the morning and I can build something out of ones and zeros, out of electrons, and bring something into existence that didn't exist before. And that way, I consider myself like an architect or a builder, right? And not everybody gets that satisfaction every day, that they can just sit down and manifest something out of electrons. And the bar to enter is getting lower all the time, and in part because of these no-code tools, in part because of generative AI. And now is the time. Like, don't wait for it to be just something you think a thought and the software appears on the screen. Like, I think anybody can build software these days if they put in a little bit of effort and time. And it's a really rewarding feeling to be able to sit down and say, like, show people and say, this is something I built, and you should try it.
So what I'm hearing is stick your toe into this ocean of possibilities, and then take a full swim, because all of that creativity and opportunity and tools and resources are there just for you to discover, and then you can dream away and create, right? and have fun doing it as well, right? So
yeah, I think you'd be surprised at what you can accomplish.
Well, thank you again, Dom, for coming in. You got this amazing career, and you got this fantastic company, Harpoon, who's doing amazing things, and you're continuing to build. And at some point, it may be I'll ask you for an interview, and you'll say, "No, I'm taking my private jet somewhere." So I'm
Never, Steven, never. I always make time for you. Thanks so much for having me on your show today. And it's really great to catch up and chat a little bit. And I look forward to the next thing you're going to teach me when it shows up.
So take care and all the best. And thank you again.
Thanks, Steven.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.